December 3rd, 1884. Margaret Sullivan stood on the snow-covered train platform in Silver Falls, Montana, her breath forming clouds in the brutal cold as she searched for a man who would never come. The telegram confirming her arrival had been sent 2 weeks ago, but Robert Mason, the rancher who'd promised her a home, a life, and respectability through marriage, was nowhere among the thinning crowd. As the last passengers dispersed into the frozen twilight, a gruff voice behind her said, "You the Boston woman? Mason's dead!" Froze to death 2 weeks back. But before Margaret could even process this devastating news, the man added something that would change everything. Found something at his place, though. Something you need to see right now, before we jump back in. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The December wind cut through Margaret's wool coat like needles of ice, each gust stealing what little warmth she'd managed to preserve during the long journey from Boston. Her fingers, already numb despite her thin gloves, clutched the handle of her carpetbag with desperate determination. 3 weeks. She'd traveled 3 weeks by train, stagecoach, and finally wagon to reach Silver Falls, Montana territory, selling everything she owned, including her grandmother's pearl brooch, to afford the passage. The man who'd delivered the news about Robert Mason stood before her now, his weathered face partially hidden beneath a fur-lined hat. He was perhaps 60, with deep lines carved by wind and sun, and eyes that held neither sympathy nor cruelty, just a sort of weary practicality. "Name's Cornelius Hawkins," he said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm the sheriff here, such as it is in a place like Silver Falls. I was the one who found Mason." Margaret's throat felt tight, but she forced herself to speak with the same composure that had carried her through her mother's death, through the loss of her position at the textile factory, through the humiliation of answering a newspaper advertisement for a bride. How did it happen? Blizzard caught him on the road back from town. His horse made it back, but Robert didn't. Found him about a mile from his cabin, frozen solid. Hawkins studied her with those steady eyes. "You got anywhere to go? Any money for return passage?" The question she'd been dreading. Margaret had exactly $3.40 to her name. Barely enough for a few nights' lodging, certainly not enough for passage back to Boston, where nothing waited for her anyway. "I'll manage," she said, lifting her chin with a pride she couldn't afford. "That's what they all say." Hawkins turned toward the street. "Come on, there's something at Mason's place you need to see." "Can't rightly explain it. Better you see for yourself." Margaret hesitated. Following a stranger into the Montana wilderness as darkness fell went against every instinct. But what choice did she have? Stand on the platform until she froze like her intended husband? "It's about an hour's ride," Hawkins continued, already walking toward a wagon hitched nearby. "We'll need to hurry. Temperature's dropping fast tonight." The wagon was basic but sturdy, pulled by 2 horses that stamped and snorted in the cold. Hawkins helped her up onto the bench, then climbed up beside her. As they left Silver Falls behind, Margaret caught glimpses of the town, a collection of wooden buildings that seemed to huddle together against the vastness of the white landscape. The Imperial Hotel, Garrett's General Store, the Silver Dollar Saloon, and perhaps 24 other structures that comprised the entire settlement. Robert Mason was a good man, Hawkins said as they rode, the wagon wheels crunching through fresh snow. "Came here about 5 years ago, built himself a decent cabin, ran a small herd of cattle. Quiet, kept to himself mostly, but reliable. When he said he was bringing a bride from back east, folks were happy for him. Then gets lonely out here." Margaret pulled her coat tighter. The cold was unlike anything she'd experienced in Boston. There, buildings provided shelter from the worst of winter. Here the cold seemed alive, aggressive, seeking any gap in clothing to infiltrate. "What did you mean, something I need to see?" she asked. Hawkins was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses around a drift that had formed across the road. "About 3 days after we found Robert, I went to his cabin to secure his belongings, figure out what to do with his property. That's when I found them. Them. The children." Margaret turned sharply to look at him. "Children," Robert had children. Not Robert's, at least I don't think so. 9 of them, holed up in an old trapper's cabin, about a quarter-mile from Robert's place. Youngest might be 4, oldest maybe 14. Half-starved, nearly frozen, living like wild animals. 9 children. Alone? Near as I can figure, they're all orphans. Maybe from different families, maybe some are siblings. They won't talk much, especially not to me or any of the men from town. The oldest boy calls himself Thomas. He's been trying to keep them alive, but they were maybe days from freezing or starving when I found them. Margaret's mind reeled. Why hasn't anyone taken them in? Hawkins gave a bitter laugh. 9 mouths to feed? In Silver Falls? Most folks are barely surviving their own families through winter. The church tried to help, brought them food, but the children wouldn't leave that cabin. They're terrified of being separated, sent to different homes, or to an orphanage in Helena. Thomas said he'd rather they all die together than be split apart. The wagon crested a hill, and in the distance, Margaret could see a cluster of buildings, a main cabin, a barn, and what looked like a smaller, more dilapidated structure partially hidden in a grove of pine trees. That's Mason's spread, Hawkins said, pointing to the main cabin. The children are in that old trapper's cabin there in the trees. I've been bringing them food when I can, but they need more than that. They need someone who knows how to care for children, someone who can gain their trust. And you think that someone is me? I think you came here looking for a new life, and those children need someone to give them life. Mason's cabin is solid, warm. His cattle are still alive. Neighbors have been feeding them, but they need tending. The land's good, water rights are clear. Legally, it all goes to the territorial government, since Robert had no kin and no wife. He paused meaningfully. Unless someone were to take responsibility for it. Margaret understood the implication. You're suggesting I stay? Take care of 9 strange children and try to run a ranch I know nothing about. I'm suggesting you look at those children and then make your choice. If you want to leave after that, I'll personally pay for your passage to wherever you want to go. They pulled up to Mason's cabin first. It was bigger than Margaret had expected, built from solid logs with a stone chimney that spoke of careful construction. Through the windows, she could see furniture, supplies, the skeleton of what could be a life. Robert was preparing for you, Hawkins said quietly. Added an extra room last month, bought fabric for curtains from Garrett's store. He was excited about starting a family. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. A man preparing for one woman to help him start a family now dead, leaving behind 9 children who needed exactly that. Let me see them, Margaret said. They walked through the snow toward the trapper's cabin, and even from outside, Margaret could see it was in terrible condition. Gaps between the logs had been stuffed with rags and mud. The roof sagged under the weight of snow, and no smoke came from what passed for a chimney. Hawkins knocked on the door, if the collection of boards hanging on leather hinges could be called that. Thomas, it's Sheriff Hawkins. I've brought someone who might be able to help. There was shuffling inside, whispered voices, then the door cracked open. A boy's face appeared, gaunt and suspicious, with dark eyes that looked far too old for his young face. We don't need help, the boy said. Thomas, this is Miss Sullivan. She's come all the way from Boston. She knows about taking care of people. Will you at least let her in to get warm? The boy's eyes shifted to Margaret, examining her with an intensity that was unsettling. Then slowly he stepped back and opened the door wider. The scene inside made Margaret's heart clench. 9 children huddled together in a space barely large enough for half that number. They'd made beds from pine needles and what looked like old flour sacks. A tiny fire smoldered in a pit they'd dug in the dirt floor, providing almost no heat. The children themselves were wrapped in whatever they could find, torn blankets, adult coats far too large for small bodies, even what appeared to be an old canvas tent. They stared at her with hollow eyes, faces dirty, hair matted. The youngest ones, not even lifting their heads from where they lay, clustered together for warmth. Margaret could see their breath in the freezing air inside the cabin. "Dear God," she whispered. Thomas stepped protectively in front of the others. "We're fine." "We don't need charity." Margaret looked at this boy, trying so hard to be a man. at the small faces peering at her from the gloom, at the middle child, a girl perhaps 8 years old, who was trying to quiet a crying toddler while her own lips were blue with cold. "What are your names?" Margaret asked softly, addressing the group rather than just Thomas. Silence, then the 8-year-old girl spoke up, her voice tiny. "I'm Lucy, this is James. He's my real brother. He's 4. As if her words had broken a dam, others began to speak. "I'm Sarah, I'm 7. William, I'm 10. My name's Mary and this is my sister Ruth. We're twins. We're 6. Benjamin, 12 years old. Ma'am, Henry, I'm 11. And finally Thomas, still suspicious but perhaps seeing something in Margaret's face that suggested safety. Thomas Wallace, 14. I'm the oldest. I take care of them." Margaret nodded solemnly. "I can see that. You've done an amazing job keeping everyone together." "We won't be separated," Thomas said fiercely. "I promised them. I promised we'd stay together no matter what." Margaret looked at Sheriff Hawkins, then back at the children. She thought of the $3 in her purse, of the empty cabin waiting nearby, of Robert Mason who died before he could start his family. She thought of her life in Boston, working 16-hour days in a factory for barely enough to eat, living in a boarding house where she couldn't even cry in privacy. Then she looked at 9 pairs of eyes watching her with a mixture of hope and fear they were trying so hard to hide. "Sheriff Hawkins," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice, "what would it take for me to claim Mr. Mason's property and take responsibility for these children? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Sheriff Hawkins stared at Margaret as if she'd suddenly sprouted wings. "Miss Sullivan, do you understand what you're saying? 9 children. That's not a responsibility you take on lightly. Neither is traveling 3,000 miles to marry a stranger." Margaret replied, her voice gaining strength as the decision solidified in her mind. "Yet here I am." Thomas stepped forward, his thin frame tense with desperate hope, barely masked by suspicion. "You mean you'd take all of us, together?" "That's what I'm proposing." Margaret looked around the freezing cabin, at the children huddled like a pack of abandoned puppies. "But first we need to get you somewhere warm. Sheriff, can we move them to Roberts, to the main cabin tonight?" "Ma'am, the legalities can be sorted tomorrow. These children won't survive another night in this condition." Margaret's tone brooked no argument, channeling the authority she'd once used to manage younger workers at the textile factory. Look at them, Sheriff. The little one's lips are blue." Hawkins rubbed his grizzled jaw, then nodded slowly. "All right, but you understand you're taking responsibility? The territorial judge comes through next month. Until then, it's my word that matters, and I'm making you accountable for these children and that property." I understand. What followed was a delicate negotiation with 9 traumatized children who'd learned not to trust adults' promises. Thomas remained the spokesperson, but Margaret noticed how the others looked to him for guidance, how he silently counted heads before making any decision. "How do we know you won't separate us once we leave here?" Thomas demanded. Margaret knelt in the dirt floor, bringing herself to eye level with the younger children, while still addressing Thomas. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. My parents died when I was 15. I had to work in a factory, sleeping in a room with 12 other girls, never having anything that was truly mine. Family, real or chosen, is the most precious thing in the world. I won't be the one to destroy yours." Lucy, the 8-year-old, tugged on Thomas's sleeve. "She has kind eyes, Tommy," she whispered, though in the small space everyone could hear. "We need more than kind eyes," Thomas said, but his resolve was wavering. "We need food, heat, someone who won't give up when things get hard." "Then let me prove myself," Margaret said. "One night. Give me one night to show you what I can offer. If you're not satisfied, you can come back here tomorrow." The youngest child, 4-year-old James, started coughing, a wet, rattling sound that made Margaret's chest tight with worry. His sister Lucy tried to soothe him, but her own violent shivering made her efforts clumsy. "Please, Thomas," Lucy said. "James is getting sicker." That broke through Thomas's last defenses. His shoulders sagged in defeat or relief, perhaps both. "One night," he agreed. "But we all go, or none of us do." The migration to the main cabin was like moving a pack of feral cats. The children clung to each other, the older ones carrying the younger, everyone clutching their meager possessions, a wooden doll with no face, a man's pocket watch that didn't work, a book with most of its pages missing. These items were clearly treasures, perhaps the only connections to their former lives. When they entered Robert Mason's cabin, the difference was immediately apparent. While not luxurious by any standards, it was solid, well-built, and most importantly warm. A proper iron stove dominated the main room, cold now but promising real heat once lit. There were actual beds in 2 rooms, a kitchen with a real pump for water, shelves lined with preserves and dried goods. Margaret immediately set to work. "Thomas, you and Benjamin, you're the tallest. Help me get this stove going. William and Henry, there's a wood pile outside under the lean-to. Bring in as much as you can carry. Lucy, Sarah, can you help me check what food we have?" She gave orders naturally, not harshly, but with the confident expectation they would be followed. The children, perhaps relieved to have direction that didn't involve mere survival, began to move. Within an hour, the cabin had transformed. Fire crackled in the stove, spreading blessed warmth throughout the space. Margaret had found Robert's stores: bacon, beans, flour, preserved vegetables, even a jar of molasses that made the younger children's eyes widen with wonder. She set about making the heartiest meal she could manage while Sheriff Hawkins helped the boys haul in enough wood to last several days. "You've done this before," Hawkins observed, watching her manage 9 children with surprising efficiency. "I helped raise my 3 younger brothers after our mother died," Margaret said, stirring a large pot of beans while simultaneously showing Lucy how to slice bread evenly. "Before my father passed too, and at the factory I supervised the younger girls." As the smell of cooking food filled the cabin, Margaret watched the children slowly thaw, literally and figuratively. The twins, Mary and Ruth, had crept closer to the stove. Benjamin was helping little James sip water, the first time she'd seen any of them accept help from each other rather than Thomas. "Where did you all come from?" Margaret asked gently as they waited for the meal to finish cooking. Thomas and Benjamin exchanged glances before Thomas answered. "Different places. Ben and I met at the Catholic orphanage in Helena. We ran away together about 8 months ago. They beat us," Benjamin added quietly, "for talking during prayers, for eating too slowly, for breathing wrong sometimes. We found Lucy and James first," Thomas continued, "living in an abandoned shed outside Butte. Their parents died in a mining accident." Lucy looked up from where she was comforting James. "Papa went down in the mine one morning and never came up. Mama got sick after. The fever took her quick. Sarah we found 2 months ago," Thomas went on, pointing to the quiet 7-year-old. "She won't talk about what happened to her family." Sarah just stared at her hands, saying nothing. "The twins' parents died of diphtheria last spring," Thomas continued. "William's father was killed by claim jumpers, and his mother—" He paused. "She just gave up after that. Stopped eating, stopped talking. William found her one morning and couldn't wake her up. Henry's the newest," Benjamin added. "We found him 3 weeks ago trying to steal food from a ranch about 10 miles from here." Henry's face reddened. "My uncle said he couldn't feed me anymore. Dropped me at the edge of town and told me to fend for myself." Margaret absorbed these stories, each one a testament to tragedy and resilience. "And you've been taking care of each other ever since." "We're a family now," Thomas said fiercely. "Maybe not by blood, but by choice. That's stronger sometimes." Margaret nodded slowly. "I agree. The strongest families are often the ones we build ourselves." She served the meal, nothing fancy, just beans with bacon, bread with a precious scraping of butter, and water sweetened with a bit of molasses, but the children ate like it was a feast. Margaret noticed Thomas waiting until all the others had full plates before taking his own portion, and she quietly added extra to his serving when he wasn't looking. Sheriff Hawkins pulled her aside while the children ate. "The legal situation is complicated," Without Robert's marriage to you being official, you have no claim to this property. The children, technically, should be sent to the territorial orphanage. But I have some discretion as sheriff. And Judge Morrison, who'll be through next month, he's a practical man. If you can show you're providing for these children, keeping them fed, warm, educated, and out of trouble, he might be convinced to make an arrangement. What kind of arrangement? Appoint you as their legal guardian. Maybe arrange for you to purchase or lease this property from the territory. It's not without precedent. Frontier law tends to favor whatever keeps children alive and cared for. Margaret watched the 9 children eating, saw how even in their hunger they shared with each other, how the older ones automatically tended the younger. Then I have a month to prove myself. You have a month to work a miracle, Hawkins corrected. 9 children, Miss Sullivan, through a Montana winter, with limited supplies and no help except what neighbors might spare, and most of them are struggling to survive themselves. I've worked miracles with less, Margaret said, thinking of the times she'd made a week's wages feed herself and her brothers for 2 weeks, of 16-hour factory shifts, followed by mending work by candlelight to earn extra pennies. After supper, the challenge of sleeping arrangements arose. The cabin had 2 bedrooms besides the main room. Margaret organized them with military precision. The 5 boys would share the larger bedroom, the 4 girls the smaller one. She would sleep in the main room where she could tend the fire and hear if anyone needed her during the night. This is temporary, she explained, as she helped them settle in with whatever blanket she could find. Tomorrow we'll assess what we have and what we need. Everyone will have proper bedding soon. You keep making promises, Thomas said quietly, as she tucked the younger boys into the large bed they'd share. People always make promises, and people always disappoint you, Margaret finished for him. I know, but Thomas, what do you have to lose? 1 night, you said. Give me this 1 night. That night Margaret barely slept. She kept the fire burning steadily, checked on coughing James twice, and simply sat thinking about the magnitude of what she'd undertaken. 9 children. She'd come here to marry 1 man and help run a simple ranch. Now she was responsible for 9 young lives, with a month to prove she could provide for them all. Around 3 in the morning, she heard soft footsteps. Lucy appeared, dragging a thin blanket, her face pinched with worry. James won't stop coughing, she whispered. He's hot but shivering. Margaret followed her to the boys' room where, indeed, little James was burning with fever. Without hesitation, she scooped him up, bringing him to the main room where she could better tend him. Lucy followed anxiously. Is he going to die? Lucy asked in a tiny voice. Like Mama? No, Margaret said firmly, though she was frightened by how hot the child felt. He's not going to die. We're going to break this fever and get him well. She spent the rest of the night bathing James's forehead with cool cloths, getting him to sip water, holding him when the chills made him cry. Lucy stayed by her side, eventually falling asleep with her head on Margaret's shoulder, while Margaret held James. When dawn broke, James's fever had reduced, though he was weak and listless. The other children emerged from their rooms to find Margaret still holding the sick child. Lucy curled against her side, the fire still burning warm. You stayed up all night, Thomas said, and there was something different in his voice. A crack in his defensive armor. He needed tending, Margaret said simply. That's what you do for family. Thomas studied her for a long moment. Then he did something that would have seemed impossible the night before. He walked over and gently took James from her arms. You need to rest, he said. I can watch him for a while. You can't take care of us if you collapse. It was the first time he'd acknowledged that she would be taking care of them, beyond this 1 night. The first acceptance that maybe, just maybe, this stranger from Boston might be their salvation. Margaret stood, her arms aching from holding James all night, and looked at the 9 children now gathered in the main room. They looked back at her, still wary, still damaged by loss and abandonment, but no longer quite as suspicious. So, she said, managing a tired smile, who wants to help me make breakfast? Every hand went up. The first week tested Margaret in ways she hadn't anticipated. Managing 9 children wasn't just about cooking and cleaning. It was about navigating 9 different personalities, 9 sets of fears, and 9 broken hearts that were terrified of hoping again. The morning after her sleepless night with James, Margaret took inventory of their situation. Robert Mason had been a prepared man, but his supplies were meant for 1 person, maybe 2, not 11 mouths. They had flour, beans, preserved goods, and some smoked meat. But at the rate 9 growing children ate, it might last 3 weeks if they were careful. "We need a system," Margaret announced at breakfast, speaking to the children as equals rather than dependents. "Everyone will have responsibilities. Not as punishment, but because that's how families work." Thomas immediately bristled. "We've been managing." "You've been surviving," Margaret corrected gently. "Now we're going to live. There's a difference." She divided tasks based on age and ability. Thomas and Benjamin would handle the heavier work: wood chopping, water hauling, and learning to tend the 3 cows and dozen chickens Robert had left behind. William and Henry would manage the middling tasks: feeding animals, gathering eggs, helping with cooking. The girls would help with household management. But Margaret was careful not to fall into traditional divisions entirely. "Lucy, you're going to learn to milk the cows too," she said, which earned her a surprised look. "And boys, everyone learns to cook and mend. Out here, everyone needs every skill." Sarah, who hadn't spoken since revealing her name, was given the special job of organizing what would become their classroom. Margaret had found a Bible and 2 other books in Robert's possessions, precious resources for education. "You can read?" Margaret asked the group. Thomas and Benjamin nodded. Lucy raised her hand halfway. The others looked down, ashamed. "Then we'll teach each other," Margaret declared. "Every evening after supper we'll have lessons. Those who can read will help those learning." The second day brought their first visitor. Ada Crawford, wife of a neighboring rancher, arrived in a wagon with her teenage daughter Elizabeth. Ada was a stout woman, with steel-grey hair and hands that spoke of decades of hard work. "Heard there was a woman out here trying to raise 9 orphans, Ada said without preamble, eyeing Margaret with sharp assessment. "Figured you were either a saint or insane." "Wanted to see which?" "Probably both," Margaret admitted, which earned her a bark of laughter. Ada had brought gifts: a sack of potatoes, some carrots from her root cellar, and most preciously, children's clothing her own grown children had outgrown. "Elizabeth hears about Lucy's size from 5 years back," Ada said, gesturing to her daughter. "These might do for some of them." While the children tried on clothes, the first new things many had received in months, Ada pulled Margaret aside. "Robert Mason was a good man, but this ranch needs work to be profitable. You can't feed 9 children on good intentions. That garden plot needs expanding come spring. Those cattle need proper feeding through winter or they won't make it. You know anything about ranching?" "Nothing," Margaret admitted. "But I learn fast." Ada studied her for a long moment. "My husband Dale needs help with our ranch, but we can't afford hired hands. Here's a proposition. Send your older boys over twice a week. They'll work, but they'll also learn. Dale will teach them ranching, and in exchange, when you need heavy help here, we'll come." It was Margaret's first lesson in frontier economics. Everyone survived through mutual aid. Not charity, but exchange. That evening, as promised, Margaret held their first lesson. Using charcoal on planks of wood, paper was too precious. She began teaching letters to the youngest children, while Thomas helped Lucy improve her reading. To her surprise, Sarah approached with the damaged book she'd been clutching since their arrival. "My mamma's," Sarah whispered, the first voluntary words she'd spoken. She read to me. It was a book of fairy tales, water-damaged and missing pages, but readable. Margaret's throat tightened. "Would you like me to read from it tonight?" Sarah nodded. That became their routine. Lessons first, then Margaret would read aloud while the children did quiet work. The boys whittling wood, the girls practicing stitches on scraps of fabric. It was during these evening sessions that the children began sharing more of their stories. Henry revealed he'd actually run away from his uncle rather than been abandoned. "He beat me, said I ate too much, cost too much. One night I just left." William talked about watching his mother fade away. "She'd sit by the window all day, looking at nothing. I'd bring her food, but she wouldn't eat. Just kept saying Papa would come back. even though we'd buried him a month before. The twins, Mary and Ruth, took turns finishing each other's sentences as they described the diphtheria outbreak that had swept through their mining camp. Everyone was sick, but Mama made us stay in the barn, away from the sick people, but she got it anyway. And Papa went 2 days later. Each story was a window into tragedy, but also resilience. These children had survived experiences that would break many adults. By the end of the first week, James's fever had broken completely, though he remained weak. Margaret fashioned a sling to carry him while she worked, keeping him close for warmth and monitoring. Lucy shadowed her constantly, learning by observation how to tend her brother and the other children. The domestic rhythm was establishing itself, but food was becoming a concern. Margaret calculated they had perhaps 2 weeks of supplies remaining, and the $3 in her purse wouldn't go far. She needed income, and fast. That's when she discovered Robert's correspondence, a neat stack of letters in a drawer, including several from businesses in Silver Falls. One caught her eye, an order from the Imperial Hotel for weekly delivery of eggs and butter, dated a month before Robert's death. "Did Mr. Mason sell eggs in town?" she asked Thomas, who'd become her unofficial deputy in managing the homestead. "Sometimes. He'd go every Saturday with whatever the chickens produced." Margaret counted their chickens. 12 hens of laying age. If managed properly, that could mean 5 or 6 dozen eggs per week. The 3 cows could provide milk for butter and cheese. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She made her first trip to Silver Falls at the end of that week, taking Thomas and Lucy with her, leaving Benjamin in charge of the others. The town's reaction to her arrival was mixed. Some, like Mr. Garrett at the general store, seemed impressed by her determination. Others whispered behind their hands about the foolish Eastern woman who'd taken on 9 wild orphans. At the Imperial Hotel, she met Mrs. Constance Whitmore, the proprietress, a formidable woman in black bombazine who looked Margaret up and down like she was assessing livestock. "You're Robert Mason's intended?" "I am. And I'm continuing his business arrangements, with 9 additional mouths to feed, I hear." News traveled fast in Silver Falls. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Whitmore's expression softened slightly. "I heard what you did, taking them in. Most would have left them to freeze." She paused. "Robert provided me with 3 dozen eggs weekly and 2 pounds of butter. Can you maintain that?" "I can. Then we'll continue the arrangement." "But Miss Sullivan," Mrs. Cartwright, Margaret corrected, using the name she'd decided to adopt for respectability's sake. Though no marriage had occurred, Mrs. Whitmore raised an eyebrow, but didn't challenge the claim. "Mrs. Cartwright, I run a respectable establishment. If I hear those children are running wild or causing trouble in town, our arrangement ends." "They won't be running wild." "You have my word." Margaret's first sale netted her $2. Not much, but enough to buy crucial supplies, needles and thread, soap, basic medicines, and more flour. Mr. Garrett extended her credit, a sign of tentative trust. "Pay when you can," he said gruffly. Robert was good for his debts. "I figure you will be too." On the ride home, Lucy suddenly said, "People looked at us strange." "Because we're different," Margaret replied. 9 orphans and an unmarried woman claiming to be a widow, living on a ranch together. We don't fit their idea of normal. Is that bad? Margaret thought carefully. Different isn't bad, Lucy. Sometimes different is necessary. Sometimes it's the only way to survive. That night she found Thomas sitting alone by the barn, staring at the stars. "Regrets?" Margaret asked, settling beside him on the rough bench. "No," he said quickly, then more honestly, "maybe. Not about coming here, but—" He struggled for words. "I've been taking care of them for so long, I don't know how to stop. Every time you handle something, I feel like I'm failing them." "You're not failing them, Thomas. You're letting them have something they desperately need, a childhood. You've been forced to be a man too soon. Maybe it's time to let yourself be 14 for a while." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I don't remember how." "Then we'll figure it out together." The second week brought new challenges. A snowstorm trapped them inside for 2 days, and 9 confined children quickly became restless. Margaret organized indoor activities. teaching the girls to make paper dolls from old newspaper, showing the boys how to carve whistles, organizing dramatic readings where each child acted out parts from their fairy tale book. During the storm, she noticed Benjamin had a gift for numbers. While helping her calculate their supplies, he could do complex arithmetic in his head faster than she could work it on paper. "Where did you learn that?" "My father was a bookkeeper," Benjamin said quietly. "Before he died, he taught me. Said numbers never lie, never leave, never disappoint you. Would you like to be our accountant?" Margaret asked. "Keep track of what we have, what we need, what we spend." Benjamin's face lit up. The first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Each child, she was learning, had hidden depths. William showed an affinity for animals, able to calm even the most skittish chicken. Henry had an excellent memory, reciting entire passages after hearing them once. The twins harmonized beautifully when they sang. Sarah, still mostly silent, drew intricate patterns in the frost on windows, her artistic soul trapped in grief. But it was Lucy who surprised Margaret most. One evening, while Margaret was teaching James his letters, Lucy approached with a confession. "I can read better than I said. And write. Mama taught me lots before she died. Why did you hide it?" Lucy looked at her feet. "Because if people know you're smart, they expect things. They leave you with responsibilities. I just wanted someone else to be in charge for once." Margaret pulled the girl into a hug. "You can be as smart as you want here. No one will leave you in charge of anything you're not ready for." By the end of the second week, a routine had solidified. Morning chores, breakfast, lessons and work, lunch, afternoon tasks, dinner, evening lessons and reading. The children were gaining weight, losing the hollow-eyed look of starvation. James ran around with increasing energy. Sarah had whispered 3 more words. The twins smiled occasionally, but Margaret knew this was just the beginning. They were surviving, yes, but winter was far from over. The judge would arrive in 2 weeks to determine their fate. And she still had to prove that 9 orphans and 1 desperate woman from Boston could somehow become a real family. The 3rd week would test that fragile construction in ways none of them could have anticipated. The 3rd week started with deceptive calm. The children had settled into their routines. The egg and butter business was providing modest income, and even Sarah had begun speaking in full sentences occasionally. Margaret allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism as she watched the 9 children working together to clear snow from the chicken coop path. That optimism shattered when Thomas came running from the barn, his face pale with panic. "The cattle are gone!" Margaret dropped the bucket she was carrying. Robert's small herd, 8 cows including their 3 milk providers, represented their only real asset beyond the chickens. Without them, they couldn't produce enough to sustain themselves through winter. "What do you mean, gone?" "The fence on the north pasture is down. Looks like it gave way under snow weight. The whole herd's wandered off, probably last night." Margaret's mind raced. 8 cows loose in Montana winter could mean death for the animals and financial ruin for their fragile household. They needed those cows for milk, butter, and eventually, come spring, for breeding and selling calves. How far could they have gotten? In this snow? Maybe 5 miles if they stuck together. But if they scattered... Thomas didn't finish the sentence. Margaret made a quick decision. "Thomas," Benjamin, "saddle the horses. We're going after them. You can ride?" Benjamin asked, surprised. "Barely, but we don't have a choice." "Lucy, you're in charge here. Keep everyone inside and warm. If we're not back by dark, you'll be back," Lucy said firmly, though fear flickered in her eyes. Margaret had ridden exactly twice in her life, both times on docile mares in Boston's public park. Robert's horses were working animals, strong and willful. When she mounted the bay mare Thomas had saddled for her, the ground seemed impossibly far away. They rode out into a white wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. The snow had stopped falling, but wind had created drifts that obscured familiar landmarks. Margaret quickly realized how easy it would be to become lost, to wander until they froze like Robert Mason had. There, Benjamin pointed to tracks in the snow. Large hoofprints leading northwest toward a grove of cottonwoods. They followed the trail for 2 hours. Margaret's legs and back screaming from the unfamiliar position and constant effort of staying mounted. Her hands, even in thick gloves, were numb from cold and gripping the reins. They found the first cow, one of their milk producers, standing bewildered in a drawer, her udder painfully swollen from not being milked that morning. Thomas managed to rope her and lead her along as they continued searching. 5 more sets of tracks splitting off here, Benjamin observed, reading the snow like a book. 3 went toward those hills, 2 toward the river. We split up, Margaret decided, though the thought terrified her. Thomas, take the 3 toward the hills. Benjamin, check the river. I'll follow this single trail here. Ma'am, that's not safe, Thomas began. Nothing about this is safe. But those cows represent our survival. We find them or we don't eat past January. Go! They separated, and Margaret found herself alone in the vast white silence. She followed the single set of tracks, talking to the horse to calm her own nerves. The trail led toward a cluster of rocks, where she found another cow, this one injured with a gash on its flank, probably from pushing through the broken fence. She was attempting to fashion a lead from rope when she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze. A low growl, followed by another from a different direction. Wolves. She'd been warned about them but hadn't truly understood the terror until she saw yellow eyes watching from the tree line. 3 wolves, perhaps 4, drawn by the injured cow's blood scent. The horse began to panic, dancing sideways, nearly throwing Margaret from the saddle. The injured cow bellowed in fear. Margaret had no weapon. She'd never thought to bring one, a potentially fatal oversight. The largest wolf stepped out from the trees, its grey coat stark against the snow, teeth bared. Margaret did the only thing she could think of. She screamed, not in fear, but in rage, in defiance, channeling every ounce of frustration and determination from the past weeks into a sound that echoed across the valley. The wolves hesitated. She continued yelling, waving her arms, making herself as large and loud as possible. Get away! These are my cattle! My children need them! You cannot have them! For a moment that stretched like eternity, predator and woman faced each other across the snow. Then miraculously, the wolf turned and melted back into the trees, the others following. Margaret's hands shook so badly she could barely hold the reins. But she managed to secure the injured cow and begin the slow journey back toward the meeting point they'd established. She arrived to find Thomas had recovered 2 of the 3 cows he'd tracked, but Benjamin wasn't there. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the snow pink and gold, worry transformed into genuine fear. We have to find him, Thomas said. His usual composure cracking, they secured the recovered cattle and rode toward the river, calling Benjamin's name. The wind had picked up, throwing snow in their faces, obscuring their vision. Margaret's worst fears played out in her mind. Benjamin thrown from his horse. Benjamin fallen through river ice. Benjamin frozen and alone. Then, through the growing dusk, they spotted a figure on foot, leading not just the 2 cows he'd been tracking, but also the remaining one from Thomas's group. Benjamin! Margaret practically fell from her horse in relief. Horse spooked and ran, Benjamin explained through chattering teeth. But I figured the cows were more important than my pride. Found all 3 near the river, trying to reach water through the ice. They made it back to the homestead as full darkness fell, driving the recovered cattle into the barn for safety. The children poured out of the house, Lucy carrying a lantern, everyone talking at once, in relief. But the crisis wasn't over. The injured cow's wound was worse than Margaret had initially thought, deep and ragged. Without treatment, infection would set in. We need to clean and stitch it, she said, though she'd never done anything like it before. I helped Papa with injured horses, William volunteered quietly, before he died. I can show you. Together, Margaret and William worked by lantern light while the other children helped hold the cow steady. William's small hands were surprisingly sure as he guided Margaret through cleaning the wound with water they'd boiled and cooled, then stitching it with the same needle and thread they used for mending clothes. It was past midnight when they finished, everyone exhausted but victorious. They'd recovered the entire herd, treated the injured cow, and most importantly, they'd done it together. But their relief was short-lived. The next morning brought a new crisis in the form of Marcus Fletcher, Silver Falls Bank representative, arriving in an official-looking black carriage. "Mrs. Cartwright," he said, the title dripping with skepticism. "I'm here regarding the mortgage on this property." Margaret's stomach dropped. "Mortgage?" Robert Mason owed $300 to the bank, due in full by month's end. "That's 10 days from now. If it's not paid, the bank will seize the property. $300. It might as well have been $3,000. Margaret had perhaps $15 to her name from egg sales and the credit at Garrett's store. Mr. Mason just died. 3 weeks ago, yes. The bank has been patient, but business is business. 10 days, Mrs. Cartwright. After that, you and these children will need to vacate." After Fletcher left, Margaret gathered the children in the main room. She'd learned that honesty worked better than false reassurance with these already traumatized souls. "We have a problem," she explained simply. "We need $300 in 10 days or we lose the house." The children absorbed this in silence. Then Sarah, quiet Sarah, who barely spoke, stood up. "We could sell things." "What things?" Margaret asked gently. "We barely have necessities." Sarah went to her corner and returned with her precious book of fairy tales. "This. Someone might buy it." One by one, the children offered their treasures. Thomas's broken pocket watch, Lucy's wooden doll, the twins' hair ribbons their mother had given them, Henry's single good shirt, Benjamin's small knife, William's carved whistle. Even little James toddled over with a smooth stone he'd been carrying, his contribution to saving their home. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "No, we don't sell your treasures. We find another way." "What way?" Thomas asked practically. Margaret thought hard. They had chickens, cows, and limited supplies. What they also had was labor and skills, but who would pay for those in Silver Falls, where everyone struggled? "The hotel," Lucy said suddenly. "Mrs. Whitmore complained yesterday that her cook quit. She said she'd have to close the dining room until she found another." Margaret's mind began working. "How many people eat at the hotel dining room?" "Maybe 20 a day," Thomas said. "Travelers, wealthy townfolk. They pay good money for meals." "Benjamin, if I could get work cooking at the hotel, how much would I need to earn per day to make $300 in 10 days? Benjamin calculated quickly. $30 a day, which is impossible. A cook might make $2 a day. Not just cooking, then. Cooking and... Margaret paused, an idea forming. "The children at the orphanage in Helena." "How many were there?" "Maybe 40, Thomas answered, confused by the change in topic. "And they're overcrowded, understaffed, desperate to place children." "Yes, but what if they paid to place children? What if wealthy travelers at the hotel could be convinced that taking in an orphan, especially one already trained and educated, was both charitable and practical?" The children looked horrified. "You're going to sell us?" Lucy whispered. "Never, but I might sell the idea of you. Make the wealthy travelers think they want to adopt, then find reasons why you're not quite suitable. Buy us time and sympathy, maybe donations." It was manipulative, possibly cruel, certainly desperate. But Margaret had learned that desperate times required desperate measures. The next morning, she put on her best dress, the one she'd planned to marry Robert Mason in, and marched into the Imperial Hotel with Lucy and Sarah flanked beside her in their cleanest clothes. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have a business proposition." The hotel proprietress looked skeptical. "I'm listening. You need a cook. I need income. But more than that, you need something to distinguish your hotel from every other establishment in Montana. What if you could offer not just meals, but exclusive evening entertainments? Music readings, cultural events that would draw wealthy travelers and local elite alike? Go on. The children I'm caring for are educated, talented. The twins sing beautifully. Thomas can recite Shakespeare. Benjamin can calculate numbers faster than an adding machine. Showcase them during dinner service. Tasteful, refined entertainment while guests dine. It would be unprecedented in Silver Falls." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes sharpened with interest. "And you would cook? 3 meals a day, plus the evening entertainment. But I need $30 a day." Preposterous. It's what you'd pay for a cook plus entertainment, plus the prestige of being the only establishment in Montana territory offering such refinement. And, Margaret played her final card, think of the charity angle. The hotel that helps sustain 9 orphans. The guests would love feeling their money goes to such a worthy cause. Mrs. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. $20 a day. 3 meals plus entertainment. 10-day trial. If the dining room isn't full every night, the deal ends. 25. 22, and that's final. Margaret calculated quickly. $220 in 10 days. Still short, but perhaps. Deal, but I need an advance. $50 today for supplies and proper clothes for the children's performances. It was bold, but Mrs. Whitmore respected boldness. 25 advance, deducted from your earnings. They shook hands. That afternoon, Margaret transformed the children into something they'd never been, performers. But she was careful to maintain their dignity. We're not begging, she explained. We're providing a service, entertainment in exchange for fair payment. You'll sing, recite, demonstrate your talents, but with pride, not pathos. The first evening was terrifying. Margaret cooked while managing 9 nervous children. The dining room filled with curious locals and travelers drawn by the novelty. When the twins stepped forward after the main course to sing a Scottish ballad in perfect harmony, the room fell silent. Their clear voices, singing of home and longing, brought tears to hardened faces. Thomas followed with a passage from Julius Caesar, his natural gravity giving the words unexpected power. Benjamin amazed everyone with his mathematical demonstrations. Even little James charmed the audience by toddling through the room, offering hand-picked winter berries Margaret had found preserved in the hotel's stores. By the end of the evening, Margaret had received $40 in tips alone. Word spread quickly. The next night, the dining room was packed. The night after that, people were turned away. Mrs. Whitmore, no fool, raised the dinner prices, and still the crowds came. But it wasn't just about the money. Something magical happened in those evenings. The children, given a stage and appreciation, began to bloom. Sarah finally found her voice, literally, singing a solo that left not a dry eye in the house. Henry discovered he could make people laugh with his perfect mimicry of local accents. William demonstrated his gift with animals by bringing in one of their chickens and showing how he'd trained it to respond to commands. By the 8th day, they'd raised $260, still 40 short with only 2 days remaining. The 9th day of their hotel arrangement dawned grey and bitter cold. Margaret counted the money again, $260. They needed 40 more by tomorrow to save their home. The children sensed the weight of the deadline, moving through morning chores with subdued efficiency. We could perform in the street, William suggested at breakfast. Like the musicians we saw that one time in Helena. In this weather, we'd freeze before earning a penny, Thomas replied practically. Margaret noticed Benjamin scratching figures on his slate, his brow furrowed in concentration. What are you calculating? Our resources versus time, he said. We have 36 eggs, enough milk for 5 pounds of butter if we don't drink any for 2 days, and, he paused, the horses. We're not selling the horses, Margaret said firmly. We need them for ranch work. Not selling, Benjamin clarified. Renting. The stage line's horses came up lame yesterday. Heard Mr. Garrett talking about it. They need replacements for tomorrow's run to Helena. It was clever thinking. Margaret felt a surge of pride at how resourceful these children had become. How much would they pay? Maybe $10 per horse for the day. We have 3 horses. That's 30. Still short, but getting closer. Margaret made a decision. Thomas, you and Benjamin go negotiate with the stage line. Lucy, Sarah, we're going to make the best dinner the Imperial Hotel has ever seen. If this is our last performance, we'll make it memorable. While the boys handled the horse negotiation, Margaret threw herself into cooking with fierce determination. She used techniques her French landlady in Boston had taught her, elevating simple ingredients into something extraordinary. The girls helped, Sarah showing unexpected talent for pastry decoration, Lucy managing multiple pots with calm efficiency. Why are you doing all this for us? Lucy asked suddenly while crimping pie edges. You could have walked away. Found work somewhere else. Started over without 9 extra mouths to feed. Margaret paused in her kneading. Do you remember what you said that first night? That I had kind eyes. Lucy nodded. Well, you had brave eyes. All of you did. Eyes that had seen too much but hadn't given up. I recognized those eyes because I saw them in my mirror every morning after my parents died. She resumed kneading with purposeful strokes. We don't abandon people with brave eyes. That evening's performance carried special weight. Word had spread about their potential eviction, and the dining room overflowed with townspeople who'd initially been skeptical of Margaret's endeavor. Even gruff Mr. Garrett was there, and several ranchers who rarely ventured to town. The children, sensing this was more than just another performance, gave everything they had. The twins sang not just one song but 3, their voices weaving harmonies that seemed impossible from such young throats. Sarah, finding courage from somewhere deep inside, told a story, the first time she'd spoken at length about her life before. My papa was a storyteller, she said, her small voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. He'd come home from the mines all covered in dust, but his eyes would light up when he'd spin tales about brave knights and magic mountains. He said stories were treasures you could carry even when you had nothing else. She proceeded to tell one of her father's stories, about a mountain that tested those who climbed it, giving them not what they wanted but what they needed. Her delivery was simple but mesmerizing, and when she finished, the room erupted in applause. Henry and William performed a comedy sketch they'd created, playing an inept sheriff and his even more inept deputy trying to catch a chicken thief who turned out to be an actual chicken. Their timing was perfect and laughter filled the room. Benjamin astounded everyone with more than just calculations. He'd been secretly practicing card tricks Thomas had taught him, and his demonstration of mathematical probability through seemingly impossible card predictions left the audience gasping. Thomas, for his finale, didn't recite Shakespeare. Instead, he spoke from his heart about family, not the one you're born into, but the one you choose and fight for. His words were simple, unrehearsed, and powerful. 9 orphans and 1 lady from Boston, he said. That's what people see, but that's not what we are. We're proof that broken pieces can make something whole if you're brave enough to try. We're proof that family isn't about blood. It's about choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. Even little James contributed, toddling through the crowd, distributing paper snowflakes the girls had taught him to make, each one carrying a hand-drawn heart in the center. When Margaret emerged from the kitchen to thank the audience, she found something unexpected. Dale Crawford, Ada's husband, stood up. Most of you know I'm not one for speeches, he said gruffly. But I've watched this woman and these children for 3 weeks now. Watched them work themselves to the bone to save a home that isn't even legally theirs yet. That ain't right, he pulled out a leather pouch. I'm contributing $20 to keep that roof over their heads. And if any of you have sense, you'll do the same. What followed was extraordinary. One by one, people stood and contributed. Not large amounts. Silver Falls wasn't a wealthy town, but $2 here, $5 there. Mrs. Whitmore added 10 from the hotel's increased earnings. Even Marcus Fletcher, the bank representative who delivered the foreclosure threat, contributed $5 with a mumbled comment about administrative discretion. By the end of the evening, they'd raised not just the $40 needed, but an extra $37 beyond that. Margaret stood before the crowd, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak. Lucy took her hand. Thank you, the girl said simply to the room. Thank you for seeing us. The next morning, Margaret and all 9 children marched into the bank. Marcus Fletcher accepted the $300 with barely concealed surprise, stamping the mortgage papers paid in full, with perhaps more force than necessary. There's still the matter of legal custody, he reminded Margaret. Judge Morrison arrives next week. We'll be ready, Margaret replied with more confidence than she felt. Walking out of the bank, little James raised his arms to be carried. As Margaret lifted him, he whispered, "Home now." "Yes," Margaret said, the word catching in her throat. "Home now. The relief of saving their home was short-lived as reality set in. The hotel arrangement had been temporary. Mrs. Whitmore made that clear. They needed sustainable income beyond eggs and butter. The ranch needed to become truly productive. Dale Crawford arrived that afternoon with his son Matthew, a sturdy young man of 18. "You helped my boys learn ranching," Dale said to Margaret. "Time I returned the favor properly. Matthew, here's going to spend a week teaching you all what you need to know. No charge, call it community investment." Matthew proved to be an excellent teacher, patient with the younger children, respectful to Margaret, and particularly effective with Thomas and Benjamin. He taught them how to repair fences properly, how to read weather signs, how to manage cattle breeding schedules for maximum profit. "Your land's got good grazing," he told Margaret one evening. "Could support maybe 50 head of cattle come spring. Of course, you'd need to buy them first." "With what money?" Margaret asked tiredly. The mortgage was paid, but they still lived week to week on egg money and occasional odd jobs the boys picked up in town. "There's ways," Matthew said thoughtfully. "Share contracts, for instance. Rancher provides cattle, you provide land and labor, split the profits when they're sold. Risky for both parties, but fair. It was something to consider." Margaret filed the information away, focusing on immediate needs. Winter showed no signs of releasing its grip, and keeping 9 children fed, clothed, and warm remained a daily challenge. But something fundamental had shifted in their household dynamic. The crisis had bonded them in ways Margaret hadn't expected. The children no longer looked to her with wariness, but with trust. They'd stopped hoarding food in their pockets. The older ones helped the younger without being asked. They were becoming what Thomas had described, a chosen family. Evening lessons evolved into something richer. Margaret discovered that Thomas had a gift for teaching, patiently working with the younger children on their letters while she helped the middle children with arithmetic. Benjamin started teaching everyone basic accounting, insisting they should all understand how money worked. "Why does everyone need to know this?" Henry asked one evening. "Because," Benjamin said seriously, "being poor isn't shameful, but being poor and ignorant about money is dangerous. We've all been helpless before. Never again." Sarah began writing down the stories her father had told her, painstakingly forming each letter. Lucy helped, having revealed she could write quite well. Together, they were creating a book of memories, preserving Sarah's connection to her past while building her future. The twins, emboldened by their performance success, began composing their own songs. Their first attempt was terrible, rhyming snow with toe and forcing melodies into awkward patterns, but Margaret encouraged them to continue. "Art isn't about perfection," she told them. "It's about expression. Keep trying." William's gift with animals expanded when Dale Crawford brought over an injured hawk he'd found. "Thing's got a broken wing," Dale said. "Thought maybe the boy might want to try nursing it. Heard he's got the touch." William named the hawk Frederick and spent hours carefully tending its wing, feeding it scraps of meat, talking to it in low, soothing tones. Within a week, Frederick was allowing William to handle him without struggle. "You could train animals," Matthew observed. "Dogs for ranches, horses for riding. People pay good money for well-trained animals, another potential income source." Margaret was learning that survival on the frontier meant multiple streams of revenue, each small but together enough to sustain life. 3 days before Judge Morrison was due to arrive, Ada Crawford visited with unexpected news. "There's talk in town," she said without preamble. "Some folks think you're doing right by these children. Others think it's improper. A single woman raising 9 children without legal authority." "I expected as much," Margaret said. "What you might not expect is that Marcus Fletcher's been asking questions. About your background, about whether you were actually married to Robert Mason. He's got it in his head that you're some sort of confidence woman." Margaret's blood chilled. If her lie about being Robert's widow was exposed, she'd lose all credibility with the judge. "What should I do?" Ada studied her shrewdly. "Tell the truth. Part of it, anyway. You came here to marry Robert. He died before you could. You took responsibility for these children because it was right. Judge Morrison's a practical man. He cares more about results than propriety. That night, Margaret gathered the children. The judge will want to speak with each of you, she explained. He'll ask if you want to stay here, if I'm treating you well, if this is where you belong. What if he says no? Lucy asked, voicing everyone's fear. Then we fight, Thomas said firmly. We've fought everything else, winter, starvation, foreclosure. We can fight this too. How? Sarah whispered. Margaret looked at each of their faces, these 9 children who'd become her world in just a few short weeks. By telling the truth, she said. By showing him what we've built here. By proving that sometimes the best families are the ones that choose each other. But even as she spoke confidently, Margaret knew the judge's decision could destroy everything they'd built. Law didn't always align with love, and the frontier, for all its freedoms, still had rules about propriety and proper guardianship. The night before the judge's arrival, she found all 9 children huddled in the main room, planning something in whispers. When she asked what they were doing, James piped up with, "Secret, good secret." She let them have their conspiracy, trusting that whatever they were planning came from love. As she tucked each child into bed that night, she realized that regardless of what the judge decided, these weeks had changed her fundamentally. She'd come west to find a husband and security. Instead, she'd found 9 reasons to fight harder than she'd ever fought before. Tomorrow would bring judgment. But tonight, in this cabin surrounded by sleeping children and gentle snowfall, Margaret Sullivan allowed herself to believe that love might be enough. Judge Morrison arrived on a Tuesday morning, his black carriage cutting through fresh snow like a hearse through white silk. Margaret watched from the window as he stepped down, a tall, angular man with silver hair and the kind of face that revealed nothing. Behind him came Marcus Fletcher and, surprisingly, Sheriff Hawkins. "Children, remember what we discussed," Margaret said, though her voice carried less certainty than she'd hoped. "Be honest, be yourselves." The judge entered without ceremony, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, the clean but worn furniture, the neat row of shoes by the door, the slate where Benjamin had been calculating their weekly expenses, the fairy tale book Sarah clutched protectively. "Mrs. Cartwright," he said, though the title held a question mark. "Miss Sullivan," Margaret corrected. Deciding Ada's advice about honesty was worth following. "I was to marry Robert Mason, but he died before I arrived. I've been using his name for respectability's sake while caring for these children." "I see." The judge settled into the offered chair, which creaked under his weight. "Sheriff Hawkins has briefed me on the situation. 9 orphans discovered in deplorable conditions now residing here under your care. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir. And you've known these children for exactly how long?" 26 days, Fletcher made a dismissive sound. "Less than a month. And she claims to be their guardian." Judge Morrison silenced him with a look. "I'll draw my own conclusions, Mr. Fletcher." He turned back to Margaret. "Tell me about each child. Not their tragic histories. Sheriff Hawkins provided those. Tell me who they are now." Margaret felt the children tense behind her, but she spoke with growing confidence. "Thomas Wallace, 14, natural leader and protector. He's learning ranch work and has a gift for teaching the younger ones. Benjamin Carter, 12, brilliant with mathematics and accounts. He manages our household books better than most adults." She continued through each child, describing not their losses, but their strengths, their growth, their potential. When she finished, the judge was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to speak with each child privately," he said. "No." Thomas stepped forward. "We stay together." "Young man, with respect, sir, we've been separated and interrogated by authorities before. It's how they decided who to keep and who to throw away. We stay together." The judge studied Thomas with interest. "You're protective of them. They're my responsibility. I thought Miss Sullivan was caring for you all. She is. But I've been responsible for them longer. That doesn't just stop because someone else is helping." Judge Morrison pulled out a leather notebook. "Very well. Together, then. Let's start with a simple question. Do you want to stay here with Miss Sullivan?" "Yes," came the chorus, even from Sarah. "Why?" Lucy spoke up. "Because she sees us. I don't understand. Most adults see 9 orphans, 9 problems, 9 mouths to feed. Miss Margaret sees Lucy and Thomas and Sarah, and she sees people. She knows I like my eggs scrambled dry. She knows Benjamin needs quiet time to think. She knows the twins harmonize better in the key of G. She sees us. The judge made notes. And you, young man, he addressed Benjamin. You manage the accounts. Show me. Benjamin retrieved his slate and ledger, presenting detailed records of every penny earned and spent, every resource allocated. The judge examined them with obvious surprise at their sophistication. This is professional-level bookkeeping. Miss Margaret says understanding money is understanding freedom, Benjamin replied. She's teaching us all to be self-sufficient. Interesting. The judge turned to Sarah. And you, child? You seem frightened. Sarah shook her head. Not frightened, careful, but not frightened. Not anymore. What changed? Miss Margaret doesn't make us forget our families. She helps us remember them while building something new. The questioning continued for an hour. The judge was thorough but not unkind, and Margaret began to hope they might succeed. Then Fletcher played his card. Your Honor, there's something you should know about Miss Sullivan's background. Margaret's heart sank. Here it came, whatever Fletcher had discovered. I've been in communication with Boston authorities. Miss Sullivan was dismissed from her position at the Lowell textile factory for, and I quote, moral turpitude and suspected theft. The room went silent. Margaret felt 9 pairs of eyes on her. Is this true? Judge Morrison asked. Margaret straightened her spine. The dismissal is true. The reasons given are not. Explain. She'd never told anyone the full story, had hoped to leave it buried in Boston. But these children had trusted her with their truths. She owed them hers. I worked at the factory for 3 years. The floor supervisor, Mr. Carlton, began making advances. When I refused, he became aggressive. One evening, he cornered me in the supply room. Margaret's voice remained steady, though her hands trembled. I defended myself with a pair of fabric shears. I cut him. Not badly, but enough to escape. The children had gone very still. He claimed I'd stolen supplies and attacked him when caught. His word against mine. They dismissed me without references. That's why I answered a mail-order bride advertisement. No respectable employer would hire me without references. You fought back, Thomas said quietly, and there was something like awe in his voice. Can you prove this? The judge asked. No, but I can prove what I've done here, what we've all done together. Before the judge could respond, James tottered forward and tugged on his coat. Story? He asked, offering his fairy tale book. Not now, James, Margaret began. Story for Mr. Judge, James insisted. Judge Morrison, perhaps amused, accepted the book. When he opened it, several papers fell out. He picked them up, and his expression changed. They were documents, carefully written in multiple hands, testimonies from each child about their life with Margaret. But more than that, they included drawings, poems, even a song the twins had composed, all expressing the same theme, home. When did you do this? Margaret asked, stunned. Last night, Lucy explained. Thomas said we needed evidence, real evidence. So we made it. The judge read through each piece. William's drawing of Margaret teaching him to milk cows. Henry's poem about feeling safe for the first time in 2 years. Benjamin's precise accounting of how Margaret spent her own money on their needs before her own. Sarah's first full story, about a woman who gathered broken birds and taught them to fly. This is highly irregular, Fletcher protested. So is this entire situation, Judge Morrison replied. He stood, walking to the window where he could see the ranch. The repaired fences, the tended animals, the organized woodpile. Miss Sullivan, you've been here less than a month. You have no husband, limited resources, and now a questionable past. By all rights, I should remove these children immediately. Margaret felt Lucy's hand slip into hers. However, the judge continued, I've been judging frontier cases for 15 years. I've seen children placed in proper homes where they were treated as unpaid labor. I've seen orphanages that were little better than prisons. And I've rarely seen what I'm seeing here. He turned back to face them. 9 children who could have scattered to survive easier chose to stay together. A woman who could have walked away, chose to take responsibility. A community that initially rejected them now supports them. Sheriff Hawkins spoke for the first time. "If I may, Your Honor, the Crawfords, the Whitmores, even Mr. Garrett have all spoken on Miss Sullivan's behalf. That doesn't happen often in Silver Falls. There's still the matter of legal standing," Fletcher insisted. "She has no claim to these children or this property." Actually, a new voice came from the doorway. "She might." Everyone turned to see a young man in a clerk's collar standing nervously at the entrance. "Pastor Williams from Silver Falls," he introduced himself. "I apologize for being late. The snow delayed my travel." "Pastor Williams?" Margaret was confused. "But Mrs. Williams said her husband, my father." "I'm Paul Williams, recently ordained. I came as soon as I received Mother's letter about your situation." He pulled out a document. "This might be relevant to the proceedings." Judge Morrison examined the paper. "This is a marriage certificate between Robert Mason and Margaret Sullivan, dated 3 weeks ago." "What?" Margaret gasped. "My father was quite ill when he performed what he thought was a blessing for your endeavor, Miss Sullivan. His mind wasn't clear. He filed this marriage certificate believing he'd actually performed the ceremony. It's properly witnessed, legally filed with the territorial office. But we never. Robert was already dead. The certificate shows a ceremony performed before his death. Clerical error perhaps, but legal nonetheless. According to this, you're Robert Mason's widow. The property is yours by right of inheritance." Fletcher went red. "This is fraud." "This is providence," Sheriff Hawkins countered. "Or bureaucratic incompetence. Either way, it's legal." Judge Morrison studied the certificate carefully. "It appears to be properly executed. Unless someone can prove deliberate fraud, which would require proving Miss Sullivan somehow manipulated a dying pastor into false filing. This stands." Margaret sank into a chair, overwhelmed. The children clustered around her, confusion and hope warring on their faces. "However," the judge continued, "the matter of the children remains separate. Miss Sullivan or Mrs. Mason, if we're accepting this document, you still need legal guardianship of 9 minors. She's been their guardian for weeks," Pastor Williams said. "Fed them, clothed them, housed them, even educated them from what Mother writes. Guardian in practice, perhaps. But not in law." Thomas stepped forward again. "Then change the law." "Young man, I don't change laws. I interpret them. Then interpret them to match what's real instead of what's written. We're a family. Maybe not the kind you usually see, but a family nonetheless. Breaking us apart because of paperwork would be the real crime." Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment. The room held its breath. "There is precedent," he finally said, "for emergency guardianship in frontier territories. Given the unusual circumstances, the documented consent of the children, the support of the community, and now your legal standing as a property owner. Mrs. Mason..." He paused, then continued more formally. "I hereby grant you temporary guardianship of these 9 minors to be reviewed in 1 year's time." Margaret couldn't speak. The children erupted in celebration, even quiet Sarah laughing as James danced in circles. "However," the judge raised his voice over the noise, "there are conditions. The children must be enrolled in formal education. Regular inspections will be conducted. Any signs of neglect or abuse will result in immediate removal. And Mrs. Mason, you might consider finding a husband. A male influence would strengthen your position considerably." "She doesn't need a husband," Lucy said fiercely. "She has us." The judge almost smiled. "Indeed she does," after the official departed. Fletcher lingering only long enough to mutter threats about watching closely the family, for that's what they were now. Legally and truly, gathered in the main room. "You fought a man with shears?" Henry asked admiringly. "I survived," Margaret corrected. "Just like all of you survived. We do what we must." "The marriage certificate," Thomas said. "It's not real." "It's real enough," Margaret replied. And perhaps Pastor Williams, in his confusion, saw a truth the rest of us missed. "Robert Mason did bring me here. In a way, his legacy is all of this. You children, this home, this chance at a future. So we're safe?" Sarah asked. "Really safe?" Margaret looked at each of them, her children now by choice and law and love. "We're safe. We're home. We're family." That night, As snow began falling again, gentler this time, Margaret found herself standing on the porch despite the cold. 9 children slept peacefully inside the house, her house, their house. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. They still needed sustainable income, still had to prove themselves to the town, still had to navigate raising 9 traumatized children in an unforgiving landscape. But tonight, she allowed herself this moment of victory. She'd come west as Margaret Sullivan, failed seamstress and desperate bride. She stood now as Margaret Mason, mother of 9, survivor of circumstances that should have destroyed them all. Behind her, the door opened. Thomas emerged, wrapped in a blanket. Couldn't sleep. Too much to think about. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching snow transform the world into something clean and new. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly, "for fighting for us, for seeing us as more than just orphans." "Thank you," Margaret replied, "for trusting me enough to let me try. We're really going to make this work, aren't we?" Margaret put her arm around the boy who'd tried so hard to be a man, who could now perhaps remember how to be young. "Yes," she said, and meant it. "We really are." Spring arrived late to Silver Falls, but when it came, it transformed the landscape with violent beauty. Snow melted into rushing streams. Brown earth emerged hungry for seed, and the air filled with the sounds of returning birds. The children threw themselves into preparing the expanded garden Margaret had planned. Their enthusiasm infectious, as they mapped out rows for vegetables they'd only dreamed of eating regularly. It had been 6 weeks since Judge Morrison's visit. The family had settled into rhythms that felt almost normal. Morning chores, lessons, afternoon work, evening reading. The egg business continued steadily, and they'd added cheese-making to their repertoire after Margaret mastered the process. Even Marcus, Fletcher's suspicious visits had tapered off as it became clear the household was thriving. Then came the morning that shattered their hard-won peace. Margaret woke to violent coughing from the boys' room. Not the dry cough of winter colds, but something wet and desperate. She rushed in to find Henry struggling to breathe, his face flushed with fever. "When did this start?" she asked Thomas, who was already at Henry's bedside. "About an hour ago. He seemed fine yesterday, maybe a little tired. Within 2 hours, William was coughing too. By noon, the twins were feverish. By evening, 7 of the 9 children were ill. Only Thomas and Lucy remained unaffected, helping Margaret tend the others. "It's spreading too fast," Margaret said to Thomas as they stood in the kitchen, heating water for the endless rounds of cool compresses. "This isn't ordinary illness." The next morning brought Dr. Edward Harrison, Silver Falls' only physician. He was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 35, with gentle hands and worried eyes. He examined each child thoroughly, his expression growing increasingly grim. "It's diphtheria," he said quietly, pulling Margaret aside. "I've seen it before. It moves through households like wildfire, especially among children." Margaret's legs nearly gave out. She'd heard of diphtheria, the disease that had killed the twins' parents, that swept through communities leaving small graves in its wake. "Can you treat it?"
"I can try."
"There's a new antitoxin, but I don't have it. The nearest supply would be in Helena, 3 days by fast horse. Even then, there's no guarantee I could get it. How long do we have?" Dr. Harrison looked at the children. Sarah barely conscious, James whimpering weakly in Lucy's arms. "Without treatment? Some might survive, the strongest. But the youngest, the weakest—" He didn't finish. "I'll go to Helena," Thomas said immediately. "The roads are barely passable with snowmelt," Dr. Harrison warned. "Rivers are flooding. It's dangerous. Everything about our lives has been dangerous," Thomas replied. "I'm going." Margaret wanted to protest, to keep him safe, but she looked at the sick children and knew they had no choice. "Take the fastest horse. Take money for the antitoxin." "I'm going with him," Lucy announced. "No, I need you here. You need the medicine more. 2 riders can switch horses, move faster. If something happens to one, the other continues. We can't risk sending one person alone." It was logical, horrible logic. Margaret pulled both children into fierce hugs. "Come back, both of you. That's an order. They left within the hour, racing against time and season. Margaret turned her attention to the sick children, following Dr. Harrison's instructions to the letter. Keep them hydrated, manage the fever, clear their airways when the characteristic membrane formed in their throats, threatening to suffocate them. The first night was hell. Benjamin's fever spiked so high he became delirious, calling for parents long dead. The twins clung to each other, too weak to harmonize, but humming brokenly in an attempt at comfort. Sarah's breathing became so labored that Margaret had to sit her upright, holding her through the long hours as each breath rattled like stones in a jar. Henry, surprisingly, rallied by morning, his fever breaking in a drenching sweat. But as he improved, William worsened. The membrane in his throat grew thicker, and Dr. Harrison had to perform an emergency procedure, cutting an opening to help him breathe. "I've never done this on someone so young," he admitted, hands shaking slightly as he prepared his instruments. "You've done it before, though." "Twice, once successfully." Margaret held William's head steady as Dr. Harrison worked, the boy's eyes wide with terror above the cloth keeping him still. The procedure was brutal but necessary, and when William finally drew a clear breath through the new opening, Margaret wept with relief. But James was failing. The 4-year-old's small body couldn't fight the disease's progression. His breathing grew shallow, his skin taking on a bluish tinge that terrified Margaret. She held him constantly, singing the Irish lullabies her mother had sung, willing him to hold on. Sheriff Hawkins arrived the second day with supplies and news. Telegram from Thomas. They reached Helena, but the bridge at Carson Creek washed out. They're trying to find another route back. Another route would add a day, maybe 2. Time they didn't have. That night, Sarah stopped breathing for nearly 30 seconds. Margaret and Dr. Harrison worked frantically, clearing her airway, breathing for her until her lungs remembered their function. When she finally gasped back to life, Margaret collapsed beside her, exhausted beyond measure. "You need rest," Dr. Harrison said. "You're no good to them if you collapse." "I can't rest. They need you alive and functional." "I'll watch them for 2 hours. Sleep." Margaret dozed fitfully in the chair, jolting awake every time a child coughed. In her brief dreams, she was back in Boston, watching her brothers die of typhoid while she stood helpless. She woke to find Henry sitting beside her, his fever finally broken completely. "I can help," he said simply. "Tell me what to do." Together, Margaret, Henry, and Dr. Harrison fought through the third night. The twins' condition stabilized slightly. Benjamin's fever broke. Even William, breathing through his emergency airway, showed signs of improvement. But James and Sarah deteriorated. Their breathing grew increasingly labored, and no amount of intervention seemed to help. Margaret found herself bargaining with God, promising anything if these children would survive. Dawn of the 4th day brought the sound of horses. Many horses. Margaret rushed to the window to see not just Thomas and Lucy, but a full contingent of riders, led by Judge Morrison himself. "We brought it," Lucy shouted, jumping from her exhausted horse with a medical bag clutched to her chest. "The antitoxin. The judge made them give it to us." Dr. Harrison grabbed the bag, his hands moving with desperate efficiency. "It may be too late for some. Try anyway," Margaret commanded. The administration of the antitoxin was painstaking. Each child required a specific dose based on their weight and disease progression. Dr. Harrison started with James and Sarah, the most critical cases. "It can take hours to see improvement," he warned. "Sometimes it doesn't work at all if the disease is too advanced." Judge Morrison pulled Margaret aside while they waited. "The children found me in Helena. They burst into the courthouse during a trial, demanding help. When I heard the situation, I commandeered the antitoxin from the hospital. They weren't pleased." "Thank you," Margaret managed through her exhaustion. "Don't thank me yet. We need to discuss something else. There's been a scarlet fever outbreak in the territorial orphanage. 20 children dead so far. They're evacuating the survivors, looking for places to send them." Margaret's heart sank. "You want to send them here?" "I want to give you the option. You're barely managing 9 children through this crisis, but you're also the only household in the region that successfully integrated orphans. If any survive from the orphanage outbreak, would you consider— How many? Unknown. Perhaps 5 or 6. Margaret looked at her children, sick, fighting but alive, because they had each other and adults who refused to give up on them. If we get through this, if all 9 survive, then yes, we'll take whoever needs us. Judge Morrison studied her with something approaching amazement. You're either a saint or completely insane. I'm a mother, Margaret corrected. That's its own kind of insanity. The antitoxin worked slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. James's breathing eased slightly. Sarah's color improved marginally, but progress was agonizing in its slowness. On the 5th day, William's emergency airway became infected. Dr. Harrison fought to control it, but infection in such conditions was often fatal. Margaret refused to accept that, creating poultices from herbs Ada Crawford brought, maintaining ruthless cleanliness around the wound. Thomas and Lucy, exhausted from their desperate ride, threw themselves into helping. Lucy had developed a slight cough, but insisted she was fine, though Margaret watched her carefully for signs of the disease. Then, on the 6th morning, James opened his eyes clearly for the first time in days. Hungry, he whispered. Margaret cried as she spooned thin broth into his mouth. One by one, the others began improving. Sarah's breathing cleared. The twins regained enough strength to hold hands. Benjamin asked for his accounting ledger, which Margaret took as an excellent sign, but William's infection worsened. Dr. Harrison prepared Margaret for the worst. The procedure saved him from diphtheria, but the infection— There has to be something else we can try. Dr. Harrison hesitated. There's a new treatment washing wounds with carbolic acid. It's controversial, potentially dangerous, but some doctors report success. Do it. The treatment was excruciating. William screamed through the procedure, his body arching in pain as the acid cleaned the infected tissue. Margaret and Thomas had to hold him down while Dr. Harrison worked. For 2 days, they repeated the treatment every few hours. William grew weaker with each session, and Margaret began to fear they were torturing him in his final days. Then, miraculously, the infection began to clear. New, healthy tissue started forming. William's fever broke for good. 2 weeks after the first symptoms appeared, all 9 children were on the path to recovery. Dr. Harrison, exhausted beyond measure, proclaimed it miraculous. By all rights, you should have lost at least 3 of them, he said. I've never seen diphtheria sweep through a household where everyone survived. We don't give up on each other, Thomas said simply. That's our rule. The crisis had changed them all. The children, who'd already been close, were now inseparable, bonded by their brush with death. Margaret had aged years in 2 weeks, her brown hair now showing premature grey at the temples, but they'd survived. More than that, word of their survival spread through Silver Falls and beyond. The woman who'd fought death itself for 9 orphans, and one, became something of a legend. A month later, when 6 survivors from the territorial orphanage arrived, traumatized, sick and hollow-eyed, Margaret took them in without hesitation. The original 9 children, led by Thomas and Lucy, welcomed them with the gentleness of those who understood loss and the fierce protectiveness of those who'd learned that family was something you fought for. 15 children, Ada Crawford said, shaking her head in amazement as she delivered supplies donated by the townspeople. Margaret, how will you manage? Margaret looked at her expanded family, some still recovering, all still adjusting, but alive and together. The same way we've managed everything else, she said. Together, one day at a time, refusing to give up. The diphtheria crisis had tested them to their limits and beyond. But in surviving it, they'd proved something crucial. They weren't just a collection of orphans and one desperate woman anymore. They were unbreakable. Summer transformed Silver Falls into something Margaret barely recognized. The endless white that had defined her first months gave way to explosive green. Grass reaching toward cloudless skies, wildflowers carpeting the valleys in purple and gold. The expanded garden flourished beyond her wildest hopes, and the 15 children working it looked nothing like the starved waifs she'd first encountered. The 6 new children from the orphanage had integrated remarkably well, guided by the original 9 who understood their trauma intimately. There was Rebecca, 13, who'd lost her family in a fire. The Hartley brothers, Daniel, 8, and Joseph, 6, whose parents had drowned in a flash flood. Twin girls named Faith and Grace, 10 years old, survivors of the scarlet fever that had claimed their entire family. And most surprisingly, 14-year-old Samuel, who'd voluntarily placed himself in the orphanage after his grandfather died. Having nowhere else to go, Samuel and Thomas had initially circled each other like wary dogs, both natural leaders uncertain how to share authority. But when Samuel revealed he could read and write in 3 languages, his grandfather had been a traveling scholar. Thomas immediately recruited him as a fellow teacher for the younger children. 15 children can't survive on eggs and vegetables, Margaret said one evening, reviewing Benjamin's meticulous accounts with Thomas. Lucy and Samuel, her unofficial counsel. We need sustainable income beyond subsistence. The cattle share program Matthew Crawford mentioned, Thomas suggested. We could approach his father about it. Or, Samuel said quietly, we could think bigger. Everyone turned to him. Samuel had been reticent his first weeks, but Margaret had learned his quiet demeanor hid a sharp, strategic mind. The territorial government is offering homestead grants to families willing to settle the northern valleys. Free land to anyone who can prove they'll work it productively. We're already overwhelmed with this ranch, Margaret pointed out. Not us directly. But what if we became a training ground? The territory is full of orphans, aging out of care, with no skills, no prospects. We teach them ranching, farming, household management. In exchange for room, board, and education, they help work this land. When they're ready, we help them claim their own homesteads. It was ambitious, perhaps impossibly so. But Margaret had learned that impossible was just another challenge to overcome. We'd need authorization from Judge Morrison, Lucy said practically, and significant investment in infrastructure, Benjamin added. More housing, more supplies, more everything. The hotel, Margaret said suddenly. Mrs. Whitmore mentioned she's looking to sell. She's getting too old to manage it, Thomas laughed. You want to buy a hotel? With what money? With partnership. We don't buy it, we manage it. Turn it into a combination boarding house and training facility. The older children work there, learning hospitality trades. The income supports the ranch operations. It was audacious. But 3 days later, Margaret found herself in Mrs. Whitmore's parlor. 15 children arranged behind her like a small army, presenting her proposal. You're suggesting I essentially give you my hotel, Mrs. Whitmore said skeptically. I'm suggesting a partnership that benefits everyone. You retain ownership but step back from daily operations. We manage it with profits split between supporting the children and providing you steady retirement income. The older children learn valuable trades. The town gets a professionally run establishment that also serves a social good. Mrs. Whitmore studied the children. All clean and neatly dressed, evidence of Margaret's civilizing influence. And if it fails, then you still own a hotel, and we've failed. But look at what we've accomplished in 5 months. 9 starving orphans are now 15 thriving children. A abandoned ranch is now producing food for half the town. We don't fail, Mrs. Whitmore. We adapt. After lengthy negotiation, they reached an agreement. Margaret and the older children would take over hotel operations, with Mrs. Whitmore as silent partner, receiving 30% of profits. It was less than Margaret had hoped, but more than she'd expected. The transformation began immediately. Thomas and Samuel organized work crews. Rebecca, who'd revealed a gift for cooking during her recovery, took charge of the kitchen with Lucy as her assistant. The Hartley brothers, young but eager, became runners and helpers. Faith and Grace, naturally organized, managed housekeeping. The younger children continued focusing on the ranch and their education. Within 2 weeks, the Imperial Hotel was running more smoothly than it had in years. Margaret instituted a novel policy. Travelers could receive discounted rates if they spent an hour teaching the children a skill. A surveyor taught basic mathematics. A seamstress from San Francisco demonstrated advanced techniques. A former soldier showed them drill. exercises that Margaret adapted into morning physical education. But the real change came when Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Edward Harrison arrived at the ranch on a blazing July afternoon, but not in his medical capacity. He carried a letter from Harvard Medical School. They're establishing a new program, he explained, training nurses specifically for frontier medicine. They need someone with practical experience managing health crises in isolation. I've recommended you. Margaret stared at the letter. I'm not a nurse. I just did what was necessary. You saved 15 children from diphtheria with minimal resources and no formal training. That's more qualification than most have. He paused. The program includes correspondence training. You could study here, continue caring for the children. They'd even provide medical supplies and texts. It meant legitimacy, resources, and the ability to better protect her growing family. Margaret accepted immediately. As summer peaked, the ranch hosted its first harvest festival, Margaret's idea to strengthen community bonds and showcase the children's progress. The entire town was invited for food, entertainment, and demonstrations of the children's various skills. The twins performed a concert that had grown far beyond their simple harmonies, now including instrumental accompaniment from Henry on a donated violin. William demonstrated his animal training with not just Frederick the Hawk, but also 2 dogs. He taught complex commands. Benjamin ran calculation contests, computing sums faster than visiting merchants with their adding machines. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah stood before the assembled crowd and told her story, not of loss, but of finding. She spoke of 9 frozen orphans who'd become family, of a woman who'd chosen them when she had every reason to walk away, of a community that had moved from suspicion to support. We were nobody's children, she concluded, her voice clear and strong. Now we belong to everybody. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience. That evening, as the celebration continued, Judge Morrison approached Margaret. I've been watching your experiment closely, he said. What you've built here is unprecedented. The territorial government wants to formalize it, create an official training institute for orphaned and abandoned youth. You'd be the director, with salary and resources provided by the territory. What's the catch? No catch. Just expansion. They want you to take more children, train them, help them establish themselves as productive citizens. You've proved it can be done. Now they want you to prove it can be replicated. Margaret looked at her 15 children, dancing, laughing, alive in ways they'd never thought possible 6 months ago. How many more? As many as you can handle. The territory has hundreds of orphans. The war back east is sending more west every month. It was overwhelming. But Margaret thought of Thomas, saying they were proof broken pieces could make something whole. These children were that proof, living testimony that love and determination could overcome the worst circumstances. We'll need more housing, she said. More staff, more everything. You'll have it. The territory is prepared to invest significantly in this program. As if sensing the momentous discussion, Thomas and Lucy approached. What's happening? Lucy asked. We're being asked to grow, Margaret said. To take what we've built and make it bigger. Help more children like you. Thomas considered this. We'd be like a real orphanage? No, Margaret said firmly. Orphanages warehouse children. We build families. We prepare futures. We create hope. Then yes, Lucy said simply. We have to say yes. Other children deserve what we have. That night, Margaret found herself on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Dr. Harrison joined her. Edward. She'd started thinking of him, though she'd never said it aloud. You've accomplished something remarkable, he said. We've accomplished it. None of this would have worked alone. No, but it wouldn't have happened at all without you. He paused, seeming to gather courage. Margaret, I need to tell you something. She waited, somehow knowing what was coming. I've grown very fond of you. More than fond. Watching you fight for these children, seeing your strength and compassion. He stopped, started again. I know you're still technically Robert Mason's widow, though we both know the complexity of that situation. But I hoped perhaps in time you might consider Edward, Margaret said gently. I care for you too. But right now, these children need all of me. Maybe someday, when they're more settled, when this program is established. But not yet, he nodded, disappointed but understanding. I'll wait, as long as necessary. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm choosing. Just as you chose these children, I'm choosing to wait for you. Before Margaret could respond, James came running. Now 5 years old and bursting with energy that seemed impossible, given his near death just months ago. Mama Margaret. Sarah says to tell you the new children are here. Margaret's heart skipped. New children? The ones from the train. Judge Morrison brought them. Margaret and Edward rushed inside to find 5 more children standing uncertainly in the main room, their few possessions clutched tight. They ranged in age from maybe 6 to 12, all bearing the hollow-eyed look of loss and abandonment Margaret knew too well. These are the first of your expanded program, Judge Morrison explained. Siblings. Their parents died in a mining accident last month. No relatives willing to take all 5 together. Margaret approached slowly, not wanting to frighten them. The oldest, a girl with fierce eyes, stepped protectively in front of the others. We stay together, she said, chin raised in familiar defiance. Of course you do, Margaret said. That's the only rule here. We stay together. Thomas stepped forward. I'm Thomas. I help run things here. That's Lucy, she's in charge of the younger kids. That's Samuel with the books. He teaches languages. Those are the twins, Mary and Ruth. They'll sing you to sleep if you ask nice. One by one, the original children introduced themselves, each offering something. Sarah showed them her story journal. William brought Frederick to perch nearby. Benjamin offered to teach them arithmetic games. The middle child of the new group, a boy perhaps 8, finally spoke. Is this real? You're really letting us stay? All of us? This is real, Lucy assured him. And you're not just staying, you're joining our family. As Margaret watched her children, all 20 of them now, begin the delicate process of absorbing new members, she thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train 9 months ago, that Margaret Sullivan had been desperate, alone, grasping at the slim hope of marriage to a stranger for survival. This Margaret, Mason by convenient fiction, mother by choice, director of an unprecedented territorial program, stood surrounded by chosen family and genuine purpose. You know what you've created here? Edward asked quietly. A very loud, very expensive, very complicated family. Margaret suggested with a smile. A revolution, he corrected. You've revolutionized how we think about orphan care, about family formation, about community responsibility. Years from now, people will study what you've done here. Margaret shook her head. I just did what needed doing. Most people don't. Most people would have gotten back on that train, returned east, found factory work. You stayed. You fought. You built this. One of the new children, a girl perhaps 6, crept closer to Margaret, drawn by something she sensed but couldn't name. Margaret knelt, bringing herself to eye level. What's your name? Annie. Well, Annie, are you hungry? We were about to have supper. Annie nodded, then asked in a whisper, Are you the lady who saves frozen children? Margaret's throat tightened at this mythology already building around their story. I'm the lady who believes every child deserves warmth and love and belonging. So are all of us here. We save each other. As the house filled with the chaos of 20 children preparing for a meal, Margaret stood in the center of it all, no longer overwhelmed, but energized. This was her life's work, she realized. Not marriage, not traditional motherhood, not conventional anything. She'd come west to find a husband, and had instead found herself. She'd discovered frozen orphans, and had rebuilt not just their lives, but her own. She'd created something unprecedented, a new form of family, a new vision of possibility. Tomorrow would bring challenges. 20 children would become 30, then 50. The program would expand beyond Silver Falls. There would be setbacks, failures, heartbreaks, but tonight, surrounded by laughter and belonging, and the irrefutable proof that broken things could be made whole. Margaret Mason stood at the center of her unlikely empire, and knew she was exactly where she belonged. The frozen orphans weren't frozen anymore. They were warm, they were loved, and they were home, and so was she. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.